The grand hall of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art glittered that night under amber lights, reflecting off wide glass panels and solemn bronze statues. The soft sound of violins echoed from the second-floor balcony, playing a modern arrangement of African melodies, nostalgic yet contemporary. The opening night of the exhibition, Traces in the Bloodline, brought together not only artists, but also scholars, politicians, and esteemed art patrons. And among them, Lucas Bennett stood alone. He wore a simple deep blue suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt fastened, holding a glass of untouched champagne. His face wasn't unfamiliar to events like these. Composure, a hint of distance, and a cautious gaze had become his signature armor. Once a rare maritime engineer who transitioned into a defense tech advisor, Lucas still carried the calm of a man used to schematics buried beneath the ocean and decisions that had to be right the first time. But tonight, as the crystal chandelier shifted its light toward the left corridor, he saw her. Not the kind of woman typically seen at gala events. No elaborate makeup, no impractically revealing gown. She wore a muted moss-green dress, her natural curls tied up, a few strands falling loosely near her neck. Her deep brown skin caught the golden light from a painting behind her, giving her a soft, almost inexplicable glow. She stood before a wooden sculpture inspired by Ethiopia, her head slightly tilted, her hands clasped gently at her waist, her eyes focused and calm, as if she were listening to a melody only she could hear. Lucas didn't know what made him approach. It could be the contrast between her stillness and the clamor around him. Perhaps it was that, in her gaze, he didn't see someone performing a role, but someone real, a rare thing in a place full of stories crafted for retelling. "Are you trying to figure out the meaning too?" Her voice came before he could speak. She didn't turn around, didn't seem startled. It was as if she had known he was there all along. Lucas paused for a second, then smiled. "I was trying to read the expression of the woman observing the sculpture, and to be honest, I couldn't." She turned to him then. That first glance wasn't startled or infatuated. It was alert, intelligent, and deeply perceptive. "Then we're observing from two angles," she said, tilting her head slightly. "One looks at art to reflect on humanity. The other looks at people to guess what they're reflecting on." Lucas laughed a real laugh. Not the polite kind often worn at such events, but a low, warm, unexpected chuckle. She held out her hand. "Amara Fields. I led a UNESCO Cultural Heritage Research Group before moving back here." He shook her hand. "Lucas Bennett. I don't lead anything nearly as interesting. Just someone who occasionally knows when to listen." "Then I hope you'll find a reason to keep listening," Amara replied, eyes narrowing playfully, between a challenge and a welcome. They didn't leave each other for the rest of the evening, not because of an impulsive bond, but because their conversation kept unfolding. About villages erased from maps by war. About submarines he had designed that could reach the ocean floor. About the specific loneliness known only to those who've lost more than once and still had to smile. No phone numbers were exchanged. No promises of next time. Just a lingering look at goodbye. And the sense that if life had a crack just wide enough, light could find its way through it. In mature love stories, there's rarely a thunderbolt, just a glance that sticks with you, a sentence that makes you pause, an evening you go home from and find your heart still. If you've ever had an evening like that, leave a comment below. And if you'd like to know what happens when two people with their scars slowly step into each other's worlds, don't forget to like, follow the channel, and watch for part 2. This journey has only just begun, and it promises not just love, but rebirth. Like at every major exhibition, after the ribbon cutting, the wine, and the polite applause, everyone eventually retreated into familiar little clusters, forming separate circles of light where congratulations and subtly coded conversations flowed to the same rhythm, soft, courteous, and somewhat dull. Lucas was usually one of the first to leave. He was used to showing up, nodding, smiling just enough, then slipping away without leaving much of a trace. But tonight, his feet didn't lead him to the elevator as they usually did. They took him around to the back hallway, a quieter place, where only a few lights spilled onto glass display cases holding old paintings under restoration. And she was there, as if she had always been there. Amara stood before a black and white photograph of Asmara's old town in the 1940s. Her arms were folded, her head tilted slightly, as though she were in dialogue with the silent space. There were no footsteps, yet as Lucas approached, she spoke. This photo was lost for nearly 30 years. A French female photographer took it, but the one who found the original negative was a young goat herder in Eritrea. Lucas smiled softly. The story's better than the photo, because people always look for stories to believe in. Sometimes, to feel like they're in the right place, at the right time. She turned to him. Like you tonight. It wasn't a flirtation, not even an attempt to probe, just a statement uncannily accurate. Lucas folded his arms and stood beside her, eyes settling on the frame. I'm not sure I'm someone who believes in fate. But you believe in instinct? She tilted her head. That if you don't follow a certain path, you might miss something important. He looked at her a little longer. In her eyes was something more than intelligence, something shaped by experience, weathered through storms, a capacity to see through and remain gentle. Where have you been? She asked, as though they were in a quiet cafe, not a chilly hallway in a museum. Lucas shared. About the Norwegian seas in the winter, he turned 29. About the first sonar system he ever designed, and the test run that nearly stranded the whole crew underwater for 3 days. About the first time he had to say goodbye to someone he didn't want to let go, but knew staying would only hurt them. Amara didn't interrupt. She listened, with the kind of attentiveness that makes you forget you're revealing too much. And you? Lucas asked, realizing he had said more than usual in months combined. Where have you been? Almost everywhere that never makes it into travel magazines. She smiled faintly. South Sudan, Kashmir, the Bolivian border, refugee camps along the Turkish frontier. I don't keep count. I remember the stories from each place I passed through. She spoke of a 12-year-old girl who knew 7 languages, had lived in 3 countries and 4 refugee camps. Of an older woman who kept a flute made from goat bone like a treasure after her entire village was burned down. And of one time, only once, when Amara had to choose to walk away to stay alive. I don't regret surviving, she said, eyes drifting into the distance. I just sometimes wonder, if I'd stayed, would anything have changed? Lucas remained silent for a long while. Some people carry instruments to measure the depth of the ocean floor, he said quietly. Some carry emotion to measure the depth of memory. Amara turned to look at him. The words didn't sound flattery, but they gently brushed that space between them. A chime rang from downstairs, signaling the end of the exhibition. The sound of heels and fading conversation retreated slowly down the corridors. I don't usually stay till the very end, Amara said, adjusting her bag over her shoulder. But tonight seems like an exception. Seems so? Lucas nodded. They walked out together, unhurried. Night had cloaked San Francisco in a thin mist, the streetlights casting a soft glow onto the damp pavement after a light rain. A taxi pulled up at the curb. I live up north, she said, her eyes not avoiding his. A few blocks from here is the night bus station. Lucas opened the car door for her, but didn't offer to come along. Instead, he said, next time, if there's a chance, tell me more about the boy who spoke 7 languages. And you'll tell me about the depth measuring device. She smiled, stepping into the car. The door closed. The taxi turned right at the first intersection, its taillights fading into the mist. Lucas stood there for a while longer, not waiting, just not wanting to end the feeling that something new had begun, without rushing. A meeting with no phone number, promises, or social media connection, but real, in a way that makes you want to take a few steps forward. And sometimes, that's enough to begin a new chapter. When the conversation starts. Behind the curtain. The next day, it rained, the cold, fine rain that lingered all morning in San Francisco, blurring the lines between the city and memory. Lucas sat in his 19th floor office, a presentation on new ocean current navigation technology open in front of him. Behind him, a misted window obscuring the distant Bay Bridge. But in his mind, every number slipped away. Every formula fell silent. Instead, there was only the image of the woman standing before the black and white photograph, with a voice that wasn't loud, yet still made people pause. He didn't have Amara's number, didn't know her social media, hadn't even asked where she worked. He only knew she used to work for UNESCO, and likely had just returned to the US. The clues were few, but he had one thing: her name, and a memory that wouldn't fade. Lucas opened his inbox and typed in a few keywords. The internal system of UC Berkeley, where he occasionally collaborated on research, still archived a group email list from a symposium where Amara had once appeared years ago. A newsletter, a joint archaeology project with UNESCO in Egypt. In less than 3 minutes, he found her email address, a Fields @ He didn't write much. Just a polite invitation, slightly formal, but sincerely worded. A symposium on underwater heritage preservation technology, where he'd be presenting the following week at the California Academy of Sciences. He wrote, "If you're free, I believe your anthropological perspective could add something valuable to the discussion. Nothing more, nothing less." He sent it, expecting no reply. So when the email alert chimed that same afternoon, and the subject line read simply, "I'll be there," his heart skipped a beat, then sped up uncontrollably. The symposium was held in a modest space. Room 204, light wood-paneled walls, an old projector screen, and rows of simple chairs. No cameras, no spotlight. Just people who truly cared, and eyes that hoped for something more than a PowerPoint deck. Lucas spoke clearly and succinctly. He introduced the new sensor device, which can read seabed sediment movement to detect submerged ruins. He explained why preserving heritage shouldn't be left solely to archaeologists, but requires collaboration across technology, ecology, and the humanities. And in the third row, Amara sat still, holding a small brown notebook and taking notes quietly, but missing nothing. After the Q&A, when the last attendee had left the room, Lucas packed up his laptop. He was almost not surprised to see she was still there. "Your presentation was better than your email," she said, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "And you showed up just like a story waiting to be told," he replied. "Do you say that to all your guests?" "Only the ones who stay till the very end." She stood up and buttoned her coat. Outside was still overcast, but the rain had stopped. "There's a cafe on the corner," she said lightly, as a suggestion, not an invitation, not a refusal. "The apple pie there's decent, if you're not allergic to cinnamon." "I'm not allergic. But I might be addicted," he said, walking beside her. The cafe was small, with old wooden tables and chipped ceramic cups. No one recognized them. No one needed to. Amara talked about her sudden return. She said she wasn't sure how long she'd stay. "An unfinished promise brought me back," she admitted. "And partly because I still don't know where I belong." Lucas didn't press for details, But in his mind, a question formed, not one to ask now, but to hold on to. Because the reason people stay is never about logic. It's about who's waiting at the end. He told her about a house in Oregon, where he spent summers as a teenager with his grandfather. It's been empty for years, but I've never sold it. Maybe because part of me still believes old things can be useful again. I don't think memories are something we use, Amara said, sipping her tea slowly. We don't go back to relive. We go back to ask if we still want to believe. Lucas nodded. No debate. The apple pie arrived, cinnamon fragrant, butter melting into the crisp crust. They ate in silence. A silence not awkward, but as if words might shatter something delicate. When they parted, there was no hug, no touch. Just a look held a little longer than necessary. Will you host another symposium? She asked, halfway turned. Definitely, he replied. Then maybe I'll come again. She walked away, her figure blending into the late afternoon streets. And Lucas, for the first time in years, found himself waiting. Not for a call, not for a message, just for a reason for someone to return. From the top floor of a building near the Sausalito bayfront, Lucas's apartment opened up to an almost unreal expanse, as if, amid a bustling city, there was still a place left where someone could breathe. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows revealed the deep blue waters beyond, where the last light of the day shimmered on the rippling surface like streaks of silver. In the distance, the Golden Gate Bridge stretched across the horizon like a thin red brushstroke. Amara stood silently by the window, holding a glass of red wine, her gaze contemplative but not sad. She didn't ask why Lucas had invited her to such a private space, nor did she search for any hidden meaning behind the invitation. She sensed that trust didn't come from the number of meetings between them, but from how they listened to each other. Lucas emerged from the open kitchen, his fingers still dusted with cheese crumbs. I'm not a great cook, he said, placing a pear tart on the table. But I learned this from my grandmother, and it usually makes people drop their guard. So you're hoping I'm guarded? Amara asked, raising an eyebrow. I'm hoping you'll stay long enough to realize you don't need to be. She let out a soft laugh, not because the line was charming, but because it wasn't trying to be. She took a seat on the leather chair by the small dining table. Outside, the sun was slipping below the bay's edge, tinting the sky a soft shade of orange mixed with purple. Do you usually live alone? She asked. Lucas nodded. Alone. By choice. Not lonely. Just quiet. Seems like a very intentional kind of quiet. She wasn't wrong. Every corner of the apartment reflected a kind of memory. A wooden table hewn from an old ship, an ink painting by the stairs, likely a gift from a Japanese colleague, and especially the long bookshelf stretching along the wall, filled with books on oceanography, philosophy, and poetry. Amara paused before a thin volume, gently turning to the first page. Adrian Rich? She said, surprised. Most men hide books like this behind rows of tech manuals. I don't usually define myself by gender, Lucas replied, pouring more wine. Or at least, not by the old rules that come with it. She didn't respond, but something in her gaze softened. The meal was simple. Tart, roasted avocado salad, a bit of smoked salmon. They ate slowly. Their conversations circled things that didn't require distance. About body language, while living among different cultures. About nights spent at archaeological sites listening to wind howl through mountain passes as if the ancient world were returning. And about the feeling of not knowing if you still belong to home after so many years outside the border. Have you ever thought about stopping? Lucas asked as the meal neared its end. What does stopping mean? Amara set her fork down, eyes drifting to the window. Living a simple life, brewing coffee every morning, and watering plants at night? Yes, I've thought about it. but I'm not sure I know how to live like that. Not because I don't want to, but because I'm afraid I couldn't hold on to it for long." Lucas was quiet for a moment. "And you?" She turned slightly toward him. "Have you ever loved someone enough to think about staying?" He didn't answer immediately. His face didn't harden, but a rare stillness was deep in his eyes. "I did," he said slowly. "But sometimes we don't stay because we didn't love enough, but we didn't dare to believe they'd stay with us." That line didn't need another word, because it already held two truths: a love that had been lost, and a man who had never quite forgiven himself. Amara leaned back in her chair. No sighs, no consolation, just the quiet empathy of someone who had also lived at the hazy boundary between holding on and letting go. The last light faded. The lights along the bay began to glow, sparkling as Christmas strings dropped across the water. The apartment grew intimate, not because of any gesture that crossed a line, but because of the presence of two people who were no longer hiding. Lucas stood and walked to the glass shelf holding a small wooden box. He opened it, took out a vinyl record, and placed it on the turntable. Warm jazz began to play, the kind that didn't sing about love, but was love itself. Amara didn't ask for anything more. She stood, walking back to the window. Her hair cast shadows on the floor, her eyes reflecting the distant waves. Lucas came near, but didn't touch her. Between them, there was no rush, no need for definition, just two people in a city that never stopped moving who had chosen, on one night, to pause. Not because of the past, not because of the future, but because they held each other. And a stillness so complete, neither of them wanted to break it. A week passed in what seemed like a stretch of ordinary days. Long technical meetings, emails answered on time, design files constantly updated on screen. Lucas still showed up regularly at the marina office, made coffee by hand instead of using the machine, and still came and went quietly like always. But one thing was no longer the same. At night, after 9 p.m., once the last office light had gone out, he often lingered on the windowsill, looking down at the street where car headlights slid slowly across fogged-up glass, and wondered, what is she doing at this hour? Reading? Listening to music? Sitting quietly in some peaceful corner, just like him, saying nothing, but acutely aware of a human-shaped absence in a once familiar space. Amara didn't text, nor did she call, but he didn't feel forgotten. Her silence didn't resemble coldness, but seemed part of her natural rhythm, where every connection had purpose, and nothing was spent just for habit. Then Saturday came, and with it, the rain. A steady, persistent rain. Not heavy, but constant, drumming faintly on tin roofs, tree canopies, and car hoods. Lucas was just about to leave a small market in the Mission District, grocery bags in hand, when he received a message. "If you don't have any special plans today, I'm near the Alley and Pine bookstore. The tea shop next door is open all day. No emojis. No hope to see you." Just a single sentence, but offered with the right amount of initiative, like she was opening a door, not pushing or pulling, gently ajar. Lucas didn't reply. He turned the wheel, leaving the road home behind, steering toward a small street between rain-soaked trees. The tea shop sat nestled behind the bookstore, no flashy sign, no crowd, just the scent of old wood and dried leaves lingering in the air. Amara was already seated in the corner, her back to the door, but when Lucas walked in, she looked up and smiled faintly, not at all surprised. She wore a soft, earth-toned sweater, an olive-green scarf, and her hair loosely tied in a low bun. A pot of mint tea and a book are folded halfway shut on the table. "How long were you lost?" she asked, as he pulled out a chair and sat down. Not long enough to forget why I was walking. She tilted her head, half teasing, half pleased. I still don't fully understand your work, she said, pouring him some tea. You talk about technology like someone who stood in a desert recognizing its importance, but knowing it won't solve everything. Because that's true. Lucas stirred his tea gently. Technology is a tool, but it's still people who make the choices. And sometimes, we use it to avoid the things we don't want to face. Like emotions? She asked bluntly. He nodded. Like emotions. The rain continued outside, its murmurs like a wordless song on rooftops and leaves. Inside the shop, a few patrons read in silence. An elderly couple shared a pastry, and two people, not lovers, not strangers, slowly stepped into each other's world, little by little. I once wrote a paper on post-colonial memory, Amara said, as naturally as if they'd been speaking across history. There was a line. People don't heal by erasing what happened. They learn to live beside it. Like living with a scar, it still stings sometimes, but no longer makes you tremble. Lucas listened. He didn't nod. He didn't comment. But his eyes held on to every word. Do you have scars? She asked, for the first time looking at him directly, not gently, but like a test. I do, he answered after a pause. And some still haven't healed, not because they're too deep, but because I haven't let anyone touch them. She didn't say anything more, but her hand rested lightly on the table, near his. Not a touch, but a presence, as if to say, I'm not asking for anything. I'm just here. The afternoon stretched on in soft shades of rain, but time no longer moved by the hands of a clock between them. They didn't speak of feelings, didn't ask about plans. They shared stories of books once read, trains caught at the last minute, scents tied to certain lands. And when Lucas walked her home under a thin umbrella, down a rain-drenched street, they stopped at the steps of an old brick building. Are you coming up? She asked, voice even, as if she were offering a second cup of tea. Lucas looked into her eyes. No implication, no seduction, just an invitation. Open, subtle, and utterly real. Amara's apartment sat on the third floor of an old brick building in Mission Dolores, where each wooden stair creaked softly, like the breath of time itself. The door opened with a brass key adorned with a small linen tassel, and as it turned gently in the lock, Lucas stepped into a space that made him pause for a beat. Not because of any elaborate arrangement. On the contrary, the apartment held a simplicity bordering on carelessness. But that was precisely what made it feel alive. Dark wooden floors, a few wool rugs from the Atlas region lining the hallway, soft amber light spilling from table lamps onto shelves overflowing with books in no particular order, several off-center film photographs on the wall, a worn leather armchair with a thin blanket thrown across it, and background music drifting from a small radio, a vintage recording of Etta James. Amara slipped off her coat and hung it neatly on a wooden hook by the door. She didn't invite. She didn't wait. She walked into her space as though he would follow. Lucas placed his umbrella by the window, watching the raindrops still trailing down the foggy glass, like thoughts not yet given a name. How long have you lived here? He asked, his voice low, as if afraid to disturb their stillness. 4 months? Amara answered, pouring hot water into 2 ceramic cups. But most of the time, I'm not home. Then why keep the place? She looked at him. Because there are places you don't have to stay long. You just need to know you can return to them. Lucas took the tea, inhaling the gentle hint of mint rising from the steam. He sat on the long bench near the window, where a hand-embroidered pillow rested its stitched words in red thread. Quiet is also a language. Amara didn't sit across from him. She moved behind, turned on a small stove, and dropped a few apple slices and cinnamon into a pot. The scent spread through the room, warm and tender, causing the questions in him to retreat before they could be spoken slowly. "Some nights," she said, as she returned with a small bowl in hand, "all I need is the sound of boiling water and the smell of cinnamon to remind myself I still exist." Lucas looked at her, a woman with her hair tied up, eyes still and calm like a lake after rain, and a voice unhurried, as though every word had been carefully chosen not to harm anything fragile. "How long have you lived alone?" he asked. "Long enough to know that loneliness isn't the scariest thing. Then what is?" She stayed quiet, placed the bowl of apples on the table, then said softly, "Losing the feeling that someone truly sees you." The answer left him silent. Outside, the rain had stopped. Streetlights began to glow, casting pale golden light through the curtain, their shadows stretching across the wall like a thin layer of memory. Amara sat down not beside him, but close enough for warmth to pass between them. Her hand rested lightly on her lap, fingers loosely intertwined, as if holding on to something not yet spoken. Lucas let his gaze wander over the mismatched photos on the wall, a smiling boy in front of a peeling mural, a woman sewing under the shade of an oak, a pair of dirt-stained hands cradling a frail kitten. "How many places have you lived in?" he asked, as if the photos had opened a doorway into her past. Enough to know no place lasts forever, but also enough to understand some people, even if they only pass through once, still leave behind the feeling of home. Lucas turned to her, his eyes settling on her collarbone, where the light caught her skin deep and smooth like honey. "Do you ever get tired of always having to be the strong one?" he asked, barely above a whisper. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, like a breeze had brushed her lashes. "Of course. But I also know I don't have to be forever. It's just no one's ever been close enough for me to let go." Her words weren't a request, not a plea, just a truth subtle and bare, like someone leaving the door slightly open before dawn. Lucas didn't move closer. He didn't need to. He reached out slowly and placed his hand gently on top of hers, not holding and not gripping. Just a touch, enough to say, "I'm here. I see you. And if you're tired, you can lean." Amara didn't pull away. The jazz music kept turning quietly. Out there, the city at night grew still, as if stepping back for a moment to make room for the kind of silence that needs no name, no words, yet lingers long after everything else fades. When Lucas woke up the next morning, sunlight had already begun to slip through the thin linen curtains, casting a pale golden strip across the white wall, chipping in places. He didn't get out of bed right away. He lay still, eyes open, staring at the simple ceiling above, listening to the steady breathing beside him, a quiet rhythm of life. Not loud, but enough to remind him this was real. Amara lay on her side, her hair gently tousled across the pillow, the thin strap of her nightdress slipping off one bare shoulder. The morning light touched her skin like the sun was afraid to intrude. Her lips softly closed, lashes casting shadows across her cheeks, her whole face floating silently through an unnamed dream. Lucas had never imagined waking up like this, not because he didn't want it, but because he never dared to. He was used to order, plans, data trails, and measurable timelines. But here, nothing was scheduled. Everything was happening. He slipped quietly out of bed, careful not to wake her, and walked toward the small kitchen. The apartment lit up in daylight, as if the night before had been just a dream, but the lingering scent of dried cinnamon on the table, 2 half-washed ceramic cups in the sink, and a single forgotten earring on the armchair confirmed everything had truly happened. Lucas made coffee by hand, the old-fashioned way, water just at a boil. 1 spoonful of dark roast, poured in slow, even circles over a paper filter. The aroma filled the space, blending with the sunlight and traces of sleep, creating a morning that needed nothing else. You make coffee like you're composing a classical piece. Amara's voice rose behind him, gentle, but no longer sleepy. She leaned against the kitchen doorway, wearing a thin sweater and barefoot, her eyes still touched with dreaminess. He smiled, not turning around. Because some music doesn't need lyrics. It just needs the right rhythm. She stepped closer, taking the cup from his hand. That light, unconscious touch between them silenced both for a brief moment. They both knew something had shifted, but neither rushed to name it. They sat on the floor, backs resting against the wall by the window. No chairs, no table, just an old wool rug, warm coffee in hand, and the city below slowly waking beneath a misty breath. I once had someone, Amara said, not looking at him. He wanted me to choose between my work and love. I chose to leave. Lucas didn't ask why. He waited. Not because I didn't love him, but because I couldn't shrink my world to fit someone else. I needed to be fully myself, even if it meant walking alone for a long stretch. He understood, because he, too, had once made someone leave. Not because he didn't love her, but because he never knew how to open up to share the space he had kept locked inside for years, thinking he was fine. Maybe we don't need to fit perfectly, he said softly. We just need to walk beside each other and leave enough room for us both to breathe. Amara turned to him, a look that didn't seek romance or promises. Just asking, was the person before her patient enough not to reduce her into something easily understood? And Lucas didn't answer with words. He extended his hand not to hold, but to rest beside hers, once more, like the night before. She didn't pull away, just sat still. And between their two hands, not touching, something shifted out of reason's control. The morning passed with an unusual slowness. They didn't leave the apartment, didn't discuss the afternoon, didn't speak of the evening ahead. They made lunch together, chose a piece of music to play, read 2 different books, but paused now and then to share a line. By afternoon, as Lucas was getting ready to leave, Amara stood by the doorway, not stopping him. You know, she said, some people don't stay because they're afraid they'll ruin something beautiful. He paused. I'm not afraid of that, she continued, eyes watching the street bathed in golden afternoon light. Then what are you afraid of? He asked. She turned back to him, this time looking directly. I'm afraid. I'll believe. And then she said nothing more. The door closed gently, not locked, not latched, just still. It was as if something had just been written, but the ending was left blank. Lucas walked away under the warm red of the afternoon sun, unsure whether he was leaving or drawing closer to something he once thought could never be his. And behind him, the 3rd-floor apartment remained lit like a heartbeat waiting for someone to return in time. 10 days passed, not long enough to feel far, not short enough not to feel the ache of missing someone. Lucas didn't text. He didn't call either. But every morning, before leaving the house, he glanced at his phone screen like a newly formed habit. Not because he expected a message, but as if to confirm that something still existed between them. For people who lived by logic, that silence had its kind of communication. Not reaching out meant respecting space, and not pushing meant preserving something that had not yet ripened. Amara hadn't sent anything either. She was busy with university lectures, extended research meetings, and final edits on a new manuscript. But one evening, passing by the tea shop on Mission Street, she stopped the car. She didn't go in. She just sat there, looking through the windshield, and unexpectedly smiled as she thought about that rainy afternoon, the peppermint tea, and the soft jazz humming in the background. They still lived, still worked, still slept and woke. But somewhere in the rhythm of their separate lives, a quiet emptiness shaped like each other. Then, on a Friday, Lucas received an email from the Institute for Sustainable Research in Portland. A 7-month collaboration offer, starting late next month. A project focused on cross-regional environmental data integration, something he had dreamed of during his PhD years. They wanted him, not just for his technical expertise, but for the human-centered perspective he always embedded in his designs. Lucas read the email in silence, with no visible reaction. But that afternoon, he didn't go home when he shut his laptop and left the office. He went straight to the bookstore near Amara's apartment. Not because he wanted to see her, but because he needed to know. If he left tomorrow, would there be something unsaid that made her feel left behind? Meanwhile, Amara sat in the back courtyard of a quiet cafe on Haight Street. She flipped through old notes, fragments of memories from her days in Ghana, from when she first set foot in America, from letters her mother used to send, which she had read so many times the edges had worn thin. Part of her had grown used to departures, leaving homes, people, pieces of herself. But for some reason, this time, she hesitated. It was as if, even without anything clearly said, she knew there was something unnamed in Lucas's eyes that day. Late that evening, Amara's doorbell rang as the city settled into a strange calm before the weekend. Lucas stood there, no warning. In his hand was an old book, its brown leather cover worn and softened. "I just reread this," he said when she opened the door, "and realized I once marked a passage, but only now do I truly understand it." Amara didn't ask why he came, nor did she look surprised. She stepped aside, let him in, and quietly closed the door. The room looked exactly as it had the last time they sat together. Warm lamplight, a pot of dried flowers in the corner, and the faint scent of tea from the kitchen. But between them, a different kind of silence had settled, not tense, not awkward, but as if they were both searching for the right words, for something undeniably real. Lucas sat in the familiar chair. He placed the book on the table. "I've been invited to Portland, 7-month project. They want me to relocate." She didn't react strongly, just nodded. "Will you go?" "I don't know." His voice was slow. "A year ago, I wouldn't have hesitated. But now, things aren't as simple as should or shouldn't. Because of me?" The question came out light, unadorned. "Not just because of you. But I no longer want to live like I don't need anyone besides me." She looked up at him. Her gaze didn't flinch. But it wasn't easy either. "I don't hold people back, and I don't believe in promises made in the moment." Lucas remained silent, but the sincerity in his eyes made any words seem unnecessary. "You don't have to promise," he said. "I just want you to know if I go, it's not because I'm turning away. Sometimes, to truly hold on to something, we must be clear about what we choose it for." Amara didn't respond. She stood, walked to the kitchen, and poured 2 glasses of water. When she returned, she set one down in front of him. "I used to think that if you ever disappeared, I'd feel relieved. At least then, I wouldn't have to choose myself." She looked up, her eyes stepping out of a layered dream. "But now, I'm not so sure. Once they've entered your heart, some things are empty, even without ties." Lucas took the glass. His fingers brushed lightly against hers. Neither said anything more. And that night, no one could say exactly where the line lay between a goodbye and a beginning. All they knew was that between them in that moment, there were no promises, no certainties, only a presence so complete that every choice felt profoundly true. And sometimes, what a relationship needs most isn't a future. It's a present quiet enough for both hearts to hear one another honestly. Lucas left on a Sunday morning at the end of the month. The city was covered in a thin veil of mist, quiet and sluggish, as if it, too, was trying to hold on to him just a little longer. Outside the train station, there was no tearful embrace, no long-winded promises. Amara stood there, her hands in her coat pockets, head slightly tilted, as if she were listening to something tiny but real, deep within herself. She didn't say keep in touch, didn't remind him to eat well. She only gave a slight nod as Lucas stepped onto the platform, like someone agreeing to something they couldn't control but didn't want to resist. In the early weeks in Portland, Lucas buried himself in work. His days were filled with technical meetings, environmental data reports, and long runs along the Willamette River as the weather began to turn. Everything was as he had imagined, challenging, expansive, full of opportunity. And yet, amidst all that was supposed to be enough, he felt the absence of a certain stillness, a space where no one asked what he was trying to prove, a space where he could sit in silence beside someone who didn't try to understand him entirely, but somehow saw the part he always hid. As Portland wore its signature gray solemnity on damp afternoons, Lucas often opened his laptop and checked his inbox. Work emails, internal bulletins, a few snippets of small talk from new colleagues, but never a line from Amara. She had kept the same distance just enough not to be forgotten, but not enough for him to feel he had any right to expect more. Then an email arrived one night while he was revising a technical draft. Not a text, not a call, just a short note, just a single paragraph. Today, I saw a woman wearing a green knit hat, just like I wore the first time we met. And suddenly, I remembered how you looked at me that day, quiet, as if you hadn't decided whether to step in or stay outside the door. There are presences that, even without touching, still keep you warm through the cold. I just wanted you to know that. There was no name, but Lucas recognized every cadence, every breath between the words. He didn't respond right away, didn't call. He just sat there, hands still resting on the keyboard, as the screen dimmed itself into sleep. Amara lived those months, as she had once learned from her grandmother, not by measuring happiness through someone's presence, but by asking whether she could live fully, even in their absence. She spent her days writing, teaching, wandering through small gallery spaces around the city, and now and then, reading alone in the old tea shop. No one knew she was waiting, not even her. But whenever Portland came up in passing conversation, she'd fall silent for a few seconds, as if she'd just brushed up against something too shapeless for words. Once, during a lecture on memory and displacement in post-colonial culture, she told her students, "We tend to believe that when we leave a place, the memories there will close themselves off. But in truth, some people shape our emotions without being near, like an underground current quietly flowing beneath things we thought we had control over." She didn't look at anyone in particular when she said it, but in her heart, a figure came into view. The man who brewed coffee like composing classical music, the man who once placed his hand beside hers without needing to touch, the man who left quietly and still managed to leave behind a glow that took months to fade. In the third month, Lucas returned to San Francisco abruptly. No warning, no reason. It simply happened in the middle of a virtual meeting, when he looked up from his screen and saw snow beginning to fall outside his Portland window. And he realized, it wasn't that he couldn't go on, it was that he no longer wanted to live without someone, just because he was afraid to disturb her peace. He booked a ticket, packed a small bag, and returned the red-eye to the city that once made him feel small enough to need someone beside him. When he landed, Lucas didn't text Amara. He walked toward the mission. The cold turned his cheeks pink, but he didn't feel cold. I noticed that his hands trembled slightly, not because of the weather, but because he wasn't sure if she'd still open the door like she used to. And when he stood before that familiar apartment, he didn't ring the bell, but stood there momentarily, as if trying to breathe again. Then, finally, he knocked. Once, then waited. No sound, no footsteps. Just as he was about to turn away, the door opened. Not with surprise, but not with indifference either. Amara stood there, the warm light from inside casting a soft glow over her face, gentle, like a June evening without wind. She didn't ask why he came, didn't scold him for not calling ahead. She stepped back, not inviting or greeting, only leaving the door open. And Lucas, this time, didn't hesitate. He stepped in. It was as if they had both understood that some things don't need to be said aloud in those brief months apart. All it takes is the right person, moment, and a heartbeat strong enough not to retreat. The door closed behind Lucas, softly, as if no distance had ever existed between them. Yet within that space, between the two of them, there remained a thin layer of silence, not piercing, but just cool enough to remind them that no matter how familiar something once was, sometimes it still needed to be touched again from the beginning. Amara didn't ask anything. She walked toward the kitchen, where the hand towel Lucas had used to dry his glass the previous night before leaving was still hanging. She made peppermint and dried orange tea, as if her hands remembered the motions, even if her heart moved more slowly. Not from hesitation, but because she considered whether she should speak first or let silence do its work. Lucas sat in the chair by the table. Everything was still in its place. The hand-embroidered tablecloth, the tiny cactus on the windowsill, a few books left half open in a stack. But the light in the room felt different, not just softer, but as if, in his eyes, every small detail now belonged to a home scented with something once familiar, yet never fully named. She set the cup of tea in front of him and sat across. Her eyes didn't avoid his, nor did they search. They looked. "You didn't call," she said, not accusing, just stating a truth in a voice as low as breath. "Because if I had, maybe you wouldn't have said anything." Amara's lips curled, not quite a smile, but not denial. Her eyes flicked to his coat sleeve, where a faint scratch lingered, a trace of some rushed journey. "Why are you here?" she asked, not necessarily for an answer. Perhaps she was asking herself. Lucas exhaled. "I'm not sure. I know that in Portland, even while doing everything right, I still felt like something was wrong." "Because of me?" Her voice was lower. "No, because of you. I knew exactly what I wanted to be right about." Amara was silent for a long while. Then she slowly stood and walked to the bookshelf. She pulled out a postcard. On the back, no address, no recipient, just a single line written in blue ink. "Sometimes we don't need a map. We need to know the person we're looking for is walking toward us too." She placed it in front of him. "I wrote it a few days ago. Never meant to send it, because I wasn't sure the person would still want to read it." Lucas read the line, his eyes flickering slightly. Then, without a word, he reached into his coat pocket and took out a small, folded handkerchief, worn and carefully kept. He opened it. Inside was a plain silver ring, no gem, no engraving, just a simple circle, preserved with unusual care. "You once said," he began, his voice low, like a cello at the end of a long hallway, "that you don't believe in promises made in a moment. And I didn't bring any promises with me." He placed the ring on the table. "But some things don't need to be named. They only need to be recognized." Amara sat back down. She didn't touch the ring, didn't push it away either. She looked at it for a long time. How someone looks at something is not measured in value, but in memories laid down layer by layer. "You think I'll wear it?" she asked, not smiling. "I don't know, and I don't expect you to. But if one day you feel there's nothing left to doubt, it'll still be here." "Here?" she asked, lightly touching the tabletop. "In whatever place you want to keep it. Not to wear, but to remember. That once, there was someone who never asked you to change, only hoped to stand beside you." Outside, the rain fell gently. It was not noisy, not clinging, just soaking into the steps, the awning, and the damp air, where things hadn't yet dried. Amara looked away from the ring and back at him. Her gaze was neither acceptance nor refusal. It was simply true. "What do you think kept us going all this time?" she asked. Lucas didn't answer right away. He looked at the cup of tea now gone cold, then into her eyes, where no defenses remained, only a quiet depth that made one want to dive in, and yet fear not finding the surface again. "Maybe," he said, "because we've both been alone long enough to appreciate the kind of silence you can share with someone without feeling lost." A minute passed. Then Amara stood. She said nothing more. She returned to the bedroom with a small wooden box, placing it in front of him. "Inside are pieces I've written but never published. Incomplete stories. Characters without endings. Why are you giving them to me?" She looked at him, slowly. "Because maybe you're the only one who doesn't need to know the ending to keep reading." Lucas didn't open the box. He just placed his hand on the lid and nodded. And that night, in the third-floor apartment on Mission, there were no long conversations, no dramatic declarations of love, no tight embraces to seal something eternal. Two people who had once drifted into each other's lives slowly were now sitting face to face, acknowledging that sometimes love doesn't come from fully understanding one another, but from choosing to walk together, even when neither has fully figured themselves out. 3 weeks after that evening, Lucas moved into the ground floor of an old house near the Mission District, just a few blocks from Amara's apartment. He didn't return to his old place, nor did he live too close. The location and distance seemed measured by instinct, just far enough not to create pressure, just close enough that a 15-minute walk would bring them face to face if needed. Amara didn't react when she learned he had moved back permanently to San Francisco. She stayed quiet, continuing her rhythm teaching on Tuesdays and Thursdays, writing in the early mornings, and spending quiet afternoons by the window, rereading fragments of old letters. Contrary to what most might expect, that proximity didn't make things easier. It didn't birth a new relationship filled with sweetness. On the contrary, closeness became a test. How would two people face each other when the safety of distance was no longer there? And Lucas, even after learning to sit quietly beside her, still had to relearn how to listen, not just to the words Amara said, but to the ones she never voiced. One Sunday afternoon, she invited him to the local farmer's market. They walked among stalls brimming with fresh vegetables, surrounded by the chatter of buyers and sellers, and the aromas of red apples, baked goods, and roasted coffee beans floating on the breeze. Amara picked up a bundle of dried lavender and gently placed it in his hand. "I don't like fresh flowers," she said. "They're too short-lived. I prefer something that keeps its shape even after the scent is gone." Lucas didn't ask why. He looked at the pale purple blossoms in his hand and nodded. It was as if that single sentence explained why she always seemed to keep things from the past, not to cling, but to remind herself that some beauty only ripens after it has slipped from your grasp. They had dinner at a small corner restaurant, only 6 tables, warm yellow lights, and classical music playing from an old cassette deck near the kitchen. Lucas told her about the children in Portland, about the workshops he had once organized with a volunteer group, where technology wasn't the goal, but the tool to rekindle human connection. There was this boy, he said, about 12 years old, living with his grandmother. He didn't talk much, but when he was given an old camera, he started photographing everything. Worn shoes, the teacup his grandma used each morning, his own shadow on the wall. Each picture allowed him to say something words couldn't. Amara was quiet momentarily, then softly asked, "Did you keep those photos?" Lucas nodded. "They're still on my hard drive." "But maybe I should have printed them." Some things only truly exist when they're held in your hands. That line reminded her of the wooden box she had given him, filled with drafts and unpublished writings, stories without endings, much like herself. On the way back, they walked through a small park. The air was growing chilly. Lucas took off his coat and handed it to her without a word. She accepted it, not because of the cold, but because the silence free of fuss or question made her feel safe. They sat on a bench by a pond, where a few kids tossed pebbles, their laughter dancing beneath the glow of streetlights. Lucas stared out at the water. "You once said some people don't stay because they're afraid to ruin something beautiful." "I did. And you?" He turned to her. "What are you afraid of now?" She didn't answer right away. Her fingers toyed with the hem of his coat. After a moment, she spoke quietly, as if to herself. "I'm afraid one day I'll wake up and realize all of this was just a pleasant phase I mistook for something real." Lucas said nothing. He understood. Not because he had experienced it the same way, but because he knew some people only believed in something once it had survived a storm. The soft, easy things, they're often more frightening than pain itself. After a pause, he said, "If it were just a phase, it would have passed by now. But you're still here. And so am I." She turned to him, her gaze still as the lake's surface. "And if we're still here, without needing rules, promises, or anyone holding the other back, then maybe that's what's most real." Lucas didn't reply. He reached out his hand, not to place it near hers as usual, but to hold it. She didn't pull away, didn't smile, just tightened her grip gently, just enough. And in that touch, nothing was declared. But nothing needed to be doubted either, because sometimes, in a city that offers no direction, people still find each other, not because of a map, but they've learned to recognize one another's signs, even in the unnamed silences. January passed by as if it weren't in any hurry. The early rains came and went, leaving the scent of damp earth and a city rinsing off old dust. In Amara's third-floor apartment, quiet little changes took place. A new potted plant on the windowsill, a hand-knit sweater hanging in the corner of the wardrobe, and a few specks of paint on the table's edge, where Lucas had brushed against it while fixing a chair leg. No one called it a transformation. They lived alongside it, like stepping into a new season without needing a calendar to tell them so. Lucas still lived in the ground-floor house nearby. Lately, however, he had habitually cycled up the Mission Slope every morning when the city was still damp with dew. He would stop before Amara's door, not knocking or entering, just leaving a pastry, sometimes a handwritten note so brief it seemed almost trivial. "The air smells like cinnamon today." Or, "Last night I dreamed of a long table in the middle of a pine forest." Amara didn't reply, but the pastry would be gone the next day. And sometimes, she left behind a wildflower, pressed between the pages of a book, a half-written poem scrawled along the edge of a torn sheet, or a peppermint candy his only cure, he once said, for staying awake through long meetings. No one put a name to what they were doing, but in silence, all those small gestures had formed a shared rhythm neither of them ever defined. One Friday evening, Amara came home late. She went straight from the university to Lucas's place, unannounced. He was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, preparing the mushroom soup she once described as the kind of meal that feels like an evening where nothing more is needed beyond the silence. She stepped into that familiar space without knocking. The scent of celery, butter, and onions melting together in the air made her smile. "You still cook the soup the same way," she said. Lucas turned around and smiled. "Because the same person still eats it." Amara took off her coat, hung it by the door, and sat in the wooden chair by the table. She said nothing more. I watched him slice mushrooms, stir the pot gently, sprinkle in some salt, taste it, and frown slightly when the balance wasn't quite right. She thought, some people, when you're with them, you don't have to work at keeping the conversation going. Their presence alone is enough to make the silence feel full. When dinner ended, they washed dishes, wiped the table, and changed the water in the little vase on the dining table. Everything moved in a wordless agreement. Like dance partners who knew the rhythm well, they didn't have to look for the next step. That night, they sat on the porch. Amara wore a robe, her legs tucked under a wool blanket, hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. Lucas sat beside her, his shoulders slightly leaning in her direction. "When I was little," she began, "I used to think each person was a season. Some people were summer vivid, magnetic, easy to fall for. Others were autumn gentle, melancholic, but full of depth. And some were winter cold, silent. But if you waited long enough, you'd find a quiet warmth deep inside." Lucas slowly turned the cup in his hand. "And what season do you think I am?" She didn't look at him, only at the sky. There were no stars, just a thin veil of clouds drifting across the moon. "You're the spring that arrives slowly," she whispered. "Not loud, not dazzling, but quietly softens everything around it." Lucas didn't answer, but inside him, something quietly opened. After a while, she rested her head on his shoulder. Not because she was tired, but sometimes people need a place to lean on, not to rise, but to feel soothed. They stayed like that until the night wind grew colder. Amara closed her eyes, her hands still wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold. Lucas didn't wake her. He gently pulled the blanket over her shoulders, letting himself quietly drift into that moment, where no one spoke of tomorrow, and no one mentioned what still had no name. The next morning, Amara returned to her apartment just after sunrise. On the table was still the silver ring Lucas had once left. She didn't wear it, but this time, she didn't put it away either. She just let it stay among the manuscripts, the unfinished pages, and a dried sprig of lavender that had begun to fade in color. She sat down, picked up a pen, and began writing again for the first time in many months, a story she had once left behind. The protagonist was a woman uncertain of where she stood in life, until one day, she met a man who didn't try to reach into her world. He walked beside her, like spring arriving slowly, yet steady enough to remain when all the other seasons had passed. One late afternoon in March, as San Francisco eased into its season of sudden rains, Amara received a call from the publishing house. The book she had written 3 years ago, once rejected by several places for being too personal, had finally been accepted with no major edits. No restructuring. "We believe its time has come." She stood in her study for a long moment. The rain had just stopped, and droplets still clung to the window pane. A vague feeling spread through her chest. Not pure joy, not quite emotion. It felt more like a part of her had just been affirmed. Something that had quietly existed all along had finally been given a name. That evening, she went to Lucas's house, no advance notice. But as always, he left his door unlocked on Friday nights. He was sitting on the floor, surrounded by large blueprints, technical designs for a school project in a remote region he was collaborating on. The warm light cast a soft glow over his tousled brown hair, and the way he furrowed his brow while reading notes made Amara linger in the doorway longer than she intended, saying nothing. Lucas looked up, as if he could feel her presence without hearing a single footstep. "Good news?" he asked, his gaze softening like someone reopening a book and unexpectedly landing on a favorite page. She nodded slowly. "No excitement. The book, it's finally being published." Lucas didn't say, "I knew you'd do it," or "You deserve this." Instead, he stood, walked to the kitchen shelf, and pulled out 2 glass mugs, the ones with the frosted etching they had once picked together at a flea market. "We don't have wine," he said, "but there's honey chamomile tea, and you once said, if there's a reason to celebrate, it should be with something that warms you from the inside out." She smiled, not at the words, but at how he remembered. The way he remembered things, she said, was when no one else was paying attention, even things no one ever expected another person to hold on to. When the tea had cooled halfway, they sat together on the porch. It wasn't raining, but the scent of wet earth still clung to the wind. In the distance, car horns blended with a jazz tune drifting from a neighbor's window. "Lucas," she said his name, with no clear expectation attached. "Yeah? Do you think, if you hadn't returned that day, what would we be now?" Lucas didn't answer right away. He looked at his hands and the space between them no longer distant, yet without defined ownership. "I think we would still be ourselves," he said, but each with a different hollow, not painful, not loud, just the kind you look into and know there was something you could have kept, but didn't. Amara nodded faintly. She understood. She knew that feeling too well, one that seems familiar with absence, yet always sends the heart slightly off beat whenever it's recalled. "Do you ever worry we won't last?" she asked. "Yeah," he answered honestly, "because no one knows what endures. But I believe, even if we're not together tomorrow, there won't be regret. Because what we've had was never forced, borrowed, or dishonest." She turned to look at him. There was no demand, question, or expectation in her gaze, just a calm acceptance, as she had finally learned to face something profound without needing to make it hers. That night, Amara stayed. Not because it was late, not because sleep came quickly, but because somewhere between unfinished conversations and just enough silences, she realized she didn't want to leave. Lucas set up the thin mattress on the floor again, added an extra blanket, and propped a pillow at the head. She lay on her side, facing the window, eyes closed but still awake. "You still up?" she whispered. "Yeah. When you wake up each morning, what's the first thing you think about?" Lucas paused. "Depends on the day. Sometimes it's a task I need to do. Sometimes it's a song from the night before. But lately, it's whether you dreamed." Amara was quiet. But after a while, she replied, "I do dream. But I rarely remember the details. That's okay. Maybe it's because real life is finally enough that you don't need to hold on to dreams." That answer made her turn over slowly. She looked at him, not clearly, just his silhouette in the dark. "So, if I want to leave for any reason one day, would you try to stop me?" Lucas didn't sigh, didn't hesitate. He replied calmly, "No, but I'd walk with you a while, far enough to know you're not coming back. And if you did look back, I'd still be within sight." For a fleeting moment, Amara felt a tightness in her chest. Not pain, but the ache from recognizing a love held not by force, but by choice. A love that stays not through possession, but through trust, and the ability to accept that the most beautiful things are often the most fragile. She closed her eyes. Sleep came like a gentle tide. Outside, the rain began again, but this time, No one needed to seek shelter. The first week of April began with a message from a major publishing house in New York sent to Amara. Your book is gaining powerful momentum. We want to propose a live panel at the Metropolitan Hall. If you're interested, we'll arrange flights and accommodations. Amara read the message while waiting for Lucas at a small cafe on the Castro hillside. She didn't respond right away. Her phone screen stayed lit, but her eyes drifted toward the window, where sunlight blurred across fogged-up glass. When Lucas arrived, she still hadn't said a word. He took off his coat, sat across from her, ordered his usual cappuccino, then quietly watched as she stirred her spoon in a cup of tea. "What's got you hesitating?" he asked, without needing to guess. She set the phone on the table, the message still glowing on screen. Lucas glanced briefly, then looked up. "New York?" She nodded. "You thinking of going?" "I don't know," she replied. "Not because I'm afraid. I don't know what's holding me back." Lucas didn't push. He leaned back in his chair, crossed one leg over the other, and gave her that familiar look that never tried to convince or urge, but always reflected the things she was trying to hide from herself. 3 years ago," she said slowly, "I used to dream of standing in a hall like that, speaking about my writing to a room full of people. Back then, I thought it would prove I was enough if it happened." Lucas stayed quiet, just listening. "But now that it's here, I feel scared. Not of failing, but I'm not sure I still need that proof." She paused, then looked at him. "Do you know that feeling? When the thing you once wanted more than anything finally arrives, but your heart's no longer standing at the starting line?" Lucas didn't respond right away. He leaned forward slightly, pulled a napkin from the table, and began tracing soft, messy lines with his spoon. "Once," he began, "back when I was working in Boston, an 11-year-old kid drew a picture for me. Just pencil lines, a door cracked open, a pair of feet stepping inside, and a dense wall of trees behind them. I asked him, 'Who's this supposed to be?' He said, 'It's me. I don't know what's behind the door, but I think it's time I walked in.'" Lucas looked up at Amara. "Maybe that's where you are right now, standing at a door like that." She smiled, not because the answer surprised her, but because it didn't like it had always been inside her, waiting for someone to name it. 4 days later, Amara boarded a plane to New York. Lucas saw her off at the airport, no suitcase in hand, no bouquet, no movie scene goodbye hug. They stood across from each other near the check-in counter. She carried a simple shoulder bag, hair tied low, no makeup, just a hint of rose on her lips. Beautiful in the quiet way of someone ready to face what used to scare them most themselves. "Do you think people like us can go far and still hold on to what matters?" she asked, lightly gripping the strap of her bag. Lucas furrowed his brow gently. "Going far doesn't change anything, Amara. It just helps you see more clearly what was always there." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. No hug, no kiss, no goodbye. Just a long, steady gaze, like they'd sealed an unspoken pact with their eyes. "If we meet again, it won't be by chance." The panel at the Metropolitan was more successful than she ever expected. Media coverage followed. Readers sent handwritten letters to the publisher. Film studios reached out to discuss adaptations, and liberal arts programs invited Amara to consult on curriculum projects. She smiled. She spoke. She thanked everyone calmly, without surprise, because deep down, Amara knew. The most beautiful part of her no longer depended on being seen. That night, after the signing, she returned to her hotel and opened her phone. There was one message from Lucas. "There's a hint of lavender in the air here, even though you took it with you. Nothing more." But she read it again and again. It was as if there was a promise without a vow in the white space between the words, a wait without demand. 2 weeks later, When Amara returned to San Francisco, the skies still carried a scattering of spring rain. She didn't send a message ahead. She didn't go straight to Lucas's house either. Instead, she stopped by the farmer's market, picked up a bundle of dried lavender and a bottle of fermented honey. Her shoes were slightly muddied, but her stride was firm, like someone who knew exactly what she was walking toward. She knocked. Lucas opened the door, still in that worn sweater, with eyes that held no sense of time having passed in between. They didn't say hello. No one asked, "Are you okay?" Amara stepped inside and set the bouquet on the table. She looked at him and said softly, "I stood in front of that door." Lucas nodded, and I walked through. He didn't ask what was behind it, because the only thing that mattered was that she had come back. There was no rain that night. Thunder, wind gusts, or sudden storms like those early in the year. Only a pleasant stillness settled over the city, as if everything had paused to make space for a necessary silence. In Lucas's small kitchen, the warm yellow light spilled across the wooden floor in a glow that wasn't harsh or glaring, just enough to feel safe. Amara stood at the sink, her fingers tracing the ceramic rim of a familiar porcelain mug she had left behind in February, which Lucas had kept in its exact place, as if waiting for something to return. She spoke without turning around. "When I was in New York, one question kept repeating in my head. It wasn't about success or recognition. It was, what, if I lost it, would make me stop being myself?" Lucas didn't respond. He placed the kettle on the stove and turned the flame low. The soft bubbling of water became the backdrop to a conversation they both knew would come eventually. "People think that when you achieve something big, you'll feel complete," Amara continued, her voice softening, as if even saying it aloud took courage. "But I've found wholeness often comes from the smallest things. A glance that needs no words. A hand offered without demand. A warm kitchen every time I return." Lucas poured the tea into the two familiar cups, sliding one gently toward her. "The thing that makes you who you are might not be what you create, but what you're brave enough to let someone else see." She looked up at him, and in that look, there was no doubt, no hesitation, only a quiet assurance, as if she finally believed that some things would remain, no matter how far she went, unchanged, unnamed, but still, always there. May passed with what might seem like unremarkable days. They didn't move in together. There was no proposal, no rings, no candlelit dinners or anniversary toasts. Yet everything between them became unmistakably clearer in the quietest of ways. Amara started a new project with students of color, researching forgotten heritage in the American South. Lucas agreed to consult with a nonprofit that provides tech access to remote communities. They still had their separate days, mismatched rhythms, and silences that weren't always filled with words. But the remarkable part was this: neither of them felt the need to validate their love through constant presence. Their connection wasn't about possession, but about something more subtle. The belief that if someone chose to stay, it wouldn't be out of duty. One Sunday morning, as Amara opened her window, she saw a small wooden suitcase on her doorstep. No name, no note. She brought it inside, opened it. Inside was a blank notebook, a fountain pen, and a handwritten line on the first page. "We don't need to rewrite what's past, but if one day you want to keep writing, here's the blank space to begin." She laughed a deep, gentle laugh, the kind that only comes when you no longer need to ask any questions. Then she picked up the pen, not to start a new book, but to begin, for the first time, writing pieces of her everyday life, the kind she once thought meaningless, but had come to realize held her most genuine emotions. Summer arrived late. Lucas brought over a new plant when lilacs bloomed full on Amara's balcony. Nothing flashy, just a small mint shrub to keep in the kitchen, for tea, or to toss into noodles, he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Amara didn't ask why mint. But that evening, as she made a simple pasta dish, she snipped a few leaves and added them to the sauce. The scent spread gently through the kitchen. Lucas stepped in, took a deep breath, and smiled. See? Some things take a little, but stay in your memory forever. Amara nodded. She knew he wasn't just talking about mint. In September, they sat on the rooftop of a friend's house during a small gathering. The early autumn breeze swept through their hair, and laughter echoed. Someone asked them, "So, what are you two exactly?" Amara glanced at Lucas, then replied calmly, "We're not the kind of people who need a label to exist." The person laughed in surprise. Not lovers? Not partners? Lucas took a slow sip of wine, then added, "Just two people who can sit in silence together for hours and still understand everything." The answer made the group around them laugh with delight. But between the two of them, there was the lightest touch of hands, a silent affirmation that love doesn't always need to be declared loudly. Sometimes, it just needs to be lived through every return, every quiet gesture, and a kind of bond that doesn't need a name. And so they continued, not by convention, not by expectation. Each day passed like an instrumental piece, but its echo lingered long, deep, like a love song never sung aloud, yet remembered for a lifetime. One autumn morning, Amara woke up before dawn, not because of an alarm, nor an unfinished dream. Sometimes, the heart wakes earlier than the mind. Today was one of those days. She stepped out of bed, pulled on a light robe, and walked barefoot onto the balcony. The sky had yet to lighten, and the air still carried the chill of the night before. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat in the wicker chair, quietly watching the city slowly open its eyes. In the distance, the windows of nearby apartments still glowed dimly, but downstairs, Lucas was already awake. She recognized the soft light from his kitchen window and caught the faint scent of toasted bread drifting on the breeze. A warmth crept through her fingers as she wrapped them around the teacup. Amara didn't call, didn't text. She sat there, waiting, as if they understood each other quietly. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door, light and steady. Lucas stepped in holding a wooden tray. 2 slices of toast, a jar of raspberry jam, and a cup of coffee made exactly how she liked it. No sugar, just a hint of cinnamon. He didn't ask why she was up early, didn't question anything. They sat beside each other, silent, sharing the toast and exchanging small smiles now and then. It was a morning without drama, without declarations, without crescendo. And yet, to Amara, it felt like the quiet and perfect final chapter to a story she once thought she'd never finish writing. The following month, Amara moved into a smaller apartment near the ocean, not because she wanted a new beginning, but because she had finished what needed to be written. The old apartment, filled with memories, dreams, and moments of collision, had fulfilled its purpose. Lucas helped her move. Not the bustling kind of help, but the kind where he stood by her side as she sorted through books and photographs. There were things they both knew to keep without needing to say so, and others quietly agreed it was time to let go. Before leaving, they stood on the balcony one last time. The wind swept through their hair, and golden leaves scattered across the floor. Amara turned to him, eyes full of late daylight. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "if we had met at a different time, would things have turned out differently?" Lucas paused in thought. Maybe they would have, but not necessarily for the better. She smiled, not happy, but one full of seasoned understanding. I used to be afraid I couldn't keep you. But eventually, I realized real love isn't about holding on or letting go. It's about being ourselves whole and kind when we're with each other. Lucas gently took her hand. Some things don't need to walk to the end of the road together to have been the whole journey. And so they hugged, not to cling, but to say thank you. A year later, Amara's second book was released. It no longer chronicled wounds or journeys of healing, but was a collection of small, everyday stories like early morning coffee, the scent of mint in the kitchen, or quiet afternoons where the heart still beat fast without a single word. Lucas was still in San Francisco, doing his work and living slowly the way he always had. They no longer saw each other every day, but they were never far. Between them was a calm silence, a kind of connection that needed no words, no constant presence. But whenever they needed the other, they knew how to find each other, not too early, not too late, but just in time. Some loves are like that. They don't need names, or promises, or happy endings wrapped in white dresses and diamond rings. They need to exist so that when you look back, you know someone once came, once touched something profound in your heart, and in their way, made you better. Maybe they're not beside you forever, but they leave behind a stronger, lighter, and more honest version of you. And as Amara wrote on the last page of her new book, love isn't a place you stay in forever. It's the place you pass through where you find a piece of yourself you thought was lost, and carry it with you for the rest of your life. If you've ever loved, ever let go, ever held on, ever waited, or ever chose to walk away quietly, then maybe this story is a part of yours too. And if you're still here, reading these final lines, thank you for walking with us through this journey. Don't forget to follow us for the next story, where the gentlest things are always waiting, somewhere very close.